Good afternoon. My name is Michael Lind. I'm the Policy Director of the Economic Growth Program here at the New America Foundation. And I'm pleased to welcome you to today's event about the Measure of America 2010 to 2011, written by Kristen Lewis and Sarah Burd-Sharps. They're co-directors of the American Human Development Project. The two are authors with Eduardo Martins of the Measure of America, American Human Development Report 2008 through 2009, the predecessor to this biannual report published by Columbia University Press, as well as a portrait of Mississippi and a portrait of Louisiana. They founded the project in 2006. Kristen comes from a background in international development and has worked in the areas of gender equality, governance, environment, and water and sanitation. She is co-author of the 2005 book, Health, Dignity, and Development, What Will It Take?, which is part of Jeffrey Sachs's Millennium Project. For 10 years, she worked at the United Nations and has served as a consultant for many international development organizations. Sarah Burd-Sharps has worked with the United Nations for over 2 decades, most recently as Deputy Director of the Human Development Report Office of the United Nations Development Program. Before that, she worked with a UN agency in China and a number of African countries on economic development and gender issues. We'll have Kristen and Sarah describe this very important report. Following that, Eugene Sterly will provide some commentary. Mr. Sterly is the Richard B. Fisher Chair and Institute Fellow at the Urban Institute and a columnist under the title The Government We Deserve, his blog, which I recommend highly. Among his past positions, he has been Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Tax Analysis, President of the National Tax Association, Chair of the Technical Panel Advising Social Security, Economic Coordinator, and his, I have to abbreviate his very distinguished biography, but I do want to say he's the author, co-author, or co-editor of 15 books and close to 1,000 articles, briefs, and congressional testimonies. So we're looking forward to his remarks after the authors describe the Measure of America 2010 to 2011. We'll begin with Kristen Lewis.
Thank you so much, Michael, for those nice words, and also thanks for inviting us to speak today. Before I go ahead, I'm just going to tell you a little bit more about our project so you understand kind of who we are. As Michael mentioned, we were established not too many years ago. We have published 2 books so far in the National Measure of America series, and also 2 state books, which take our same methodology and apply them to the state level in Mississippi and Louisiana. And in May, we're going to launch another book on California, where we'll be using the same methodology. And we also have a website that you can go to. So today, I'm going to tell you a bit about human development, what it is. Then I'll tell you about what our index reveals and what our research finds. And then I'll turn it over to Sarah, who's going to take a deep dive into health, education, and income, which are the 3 areas that our index measures. So what is this concept of human development? Human development basically emphasizes the everyday experience of ordinary people. It's really about what regular people can do and become in their lives. Its sort of formal definition is enlarging the choices and opportunities of people and improving their well-being. Whereas the traditional approach to understanding progress using economic metrics like GDP asks the question, how is the economy doing? The human development approach asks a different question that we would argue is maybe more important, which is how are people doing? Human development is very much about what people can do themselves, so human agency is critically important, but it's also about how the conditions and institutions in our society constrain or enhance our choices and opportunities. And the human development approach really sees money as important, but as a means to a host of valuable ends, and not as an end in and of itself. So this idea, human development, has been successful around the world in broadening the way in which people understand, measure, and track human well-being. Again, moving from strictly economic measures to other things that capture our what the things that expand our choices and opportunities. The idea was developed at the United Nations. It was pioneered at the United Nations, and our work is based very much on the Human Development Report Series of the United Nations. This human development approach, along with the Hallmark Human Development Index, are known and used pretty much in every country in the world except for this one. And the idea draws very heavily on the work of Amartya Sen, using his capabilities approach as a conceptual framework. So capabilities are, in essence, the tools a person has for living and for living a freely chosen life of value. So core capabilities include things like good health, access to knowledge, standard of living, the ability to participate in decisions that affect you, freedom of belief and conscience, family and community bonds, and more. So it's a very broad concept. You know, as I mentioned, it's been used around the world. Over 150 countries have these human development reports at the national level, in addition to the global series that comes out every year since 1990. In Philippines, the HDI, the Human Development Index, is now a government statistic, an official government statistic. In Brazil, the index is available for 5,000 municipalities, and businesses use it as a way to determine where to site plants and where to open stores and things like that. And in the Arab region, the Arab Human Development Report Series has really helped to define the debate, not just internationally, but also within the Arab region, about the key issues facing the region, particularly deficits in knowledge, freedom, gender equality, and human security. And this is a little visual of what human development is. So here you see a person standing there, and he or she has very few of these little light bulbs around him lit up. Okay, so that means that his or her opportunities are constrained. And human development is basically just about expanding those capabilities so that people have more choices and opportunities. So as I mentioned before, this concept of human development is extremely broad and very far-reaching, including all the things that shape the opportunities open to us, from our family situation to our religious belief to our income and everything. But there's really no way to measure such a holistic concept. So the American Human Development Index measures just 3 areas: a long and healthy life, access to knowledge, and a decent standard of living. So people the world over see these as the building blocks of well-being and opportunity, and we would argue that they're also the issues that Americans really care about most, and the kind of things people are talking about around their kitchen table at night. And these are also the same 3 general areas that the Global Human Development Index measures. But we've changed the indicators that we use so that we have something that's more relevant to an affluent democracy. So in terms of health, the indicator we use is life expectancy, which is calculated from mortality data from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention at the national level. And when we use the state reports, we use the state's Departments of Health's data. Our education index combines degree attainment for the population 25 and older with school enrollment for the population age 3 to 24. So we get in those important preschool years. And in income, we use median personal earnings for all full and part-time workers age 16 and up. Just one thing to say about that. We use median personal earnings because we want to be able to disaggregate our index by gender, and men and women typically live together in households. So, you know, these figures might look low to you because you're probably used to seeing household earnings figures. So what we do basically is we add these 3 indices together and we divide by 3, and then we get the Human Development Index, which is a single number on a scale from 0 to 10, 10 being high and 0 being low. And then we disaggregate the index by geographic area, so by state, by congressional district, and in states where we've done reports all the way down to sort of groups of about 100,000 people. And then we also provide an index ranking for the major metropolitan areas. And then we also divvy up the pie by racial and ethnic groups and by gender. So what we found is basically, we'll start with the sort of historical context. So from a historical perspective in these 3 fundamental areas of health, education, and income, we've made a lot of progress. The index score for the country as a whole has increased 4-fold over the last half century since 1960. And the way we created this index was we just took the same data points that we use for our index today, but we took the data from 1960, 70, 80, 90, 2000, 2005, and 2009. Or that's 2008, I think, yeah. So the typical American today lives 9 years longer than the average American in 1960, from a bit less than 70 years to about 78 and a half years. In terms of education, Americans today are twice as likely to have completed high school than they were in 1960. In 1960, only 41% of American adults aged 25 and older had completed high school. And Americans today are 4 times more likely to have completed college and also 4 times as likely to have a graduate degree. In terms of income, the typical American is earning $12,000 more in constant dollars than in 1960, though note that the growth has been completely flat and even inched backwards since 2000. 2 things are really important to keep in mind when you're looking at this chart. First, it's not sort of the magical passage of time that has created these better outcomes for people. As Martin Luther King Jr. said, human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through tireless efforts and persistent hard work. So this human progress was the result of deliberate investments in people. And second, this is the progress for the country as a whole. So it's a positive story. But when we disaggregate the index, we really see clearly that some groups of Americans are surging ahead and enjoying the highest levels of well-being in the world, whereas others have really been left behind with indicators more typical of the country as a whole in 1960 or 1970, 1980. So I've already put up this slide. This is our index by state. The darker colors represent higher levels of human development, and the lighter colors lower levels of human development. Does anyone want to hazard a guess as to what is our top-ranked state in our index? Connecticut. Yes, a new refrigerator to the person who guessed for Connecticut. And the low on our list this year is West Virginia. Okay, so sometimes when we say this, people are like, yeah, and what's the news, right? Because everyone knows that for decades, West Virginia, the Mississippi Delta have really struggled, whereas Connecticut is, doing pretty well. If you remember the trend line we showed earlier, Connecticut is where the country as a whole, if current trends continue, is going to be in 2020, whereas West Virginia is where the rest of the country was 2 decades ago in terms of human well-being. So the top and bottom states are separated in essence by a generation of human progress. People in Connecticut are living 5 years longer. They're twice as likely to have a bachelor's degree or graduate degree, and they earn 50% more median earnings than people in West Virginia. So we knew there was a gap, but we didn't really realize it would be a whole generation gap, in a sense, between 2 states. Here we have the index disaggregated by congressional districts. So as I know everyone in Washington, D.C. knows, there are 435 congressional districts in the country, each having about 650,000 people. So when we compare congressional districts, we're really comparing apples to apples in terms of population size. The top congressional district is Congressional District 14 in New York. That's sort of the east side of Manhattan, more or less. And the bottom is Congressional District 20 in California. That's around Fresno in the Central Valley there. And a lot of people are surprised by that. They would assume the lowest would be, again, in the Mississippi Delta area or in Appalachia. These 2 districts, again, are extremely far apart in human development terms. The New York resident is 5 times more likely to have completed high school, 9 times more likely to have completed college, and earns 3 times more. So New York is where the country as a whole is going to be in 4 decades, in 40 years, if current trends continue, whereas Congressional District 20 is where the country as a whole was in the mid-1970s. So that's a 75-year human development gap between these 2 congressional districts. Then we also disaggregated by racial and ethnic groups within states. So, this is where we saw the biggest gap. Asian Americans in New Jersey were the racial state combination doing the best of any group in the country, and Native Americans in South Dakota were doing the worst. Asian Americans in New Jersey are where the country as a whole is going to be in 50 years, and Native Americans in South Dakota are where the country as a whole was in terms of health, education, and income indicators 50 years ago. So they're in essence a century apart, these 2 groups of Americans. We also disaggregated and gave scores to the 10 largest metropolitan areas, which together have about 25% of the U.S. population. Chicago was 5th, but you can see that even in Chicago, which is 5th overall, you have these huge gaps. So Chicago was 5th among all of them, but it's the best metro area for Asian Americans, and it's the worst metro area for African Americans. So just compare the life expectancy gap. It's over 90 years for Asian Americans in Chicago, and about 73 years for African Americans in Chicago, and about a 17-year gap, which is pretty huge. So we used to have this slide first, and we've decided to put it now because we wanted to first show you some of the results, so that it would be easier to convince you that there are some benefits to this new approach that we have here for the United States. First is that we really hope that it would move the conversation beyond GDP and beyond metrics, money metrics, as the chief gauge of human well-being, making the case that other things matter actually besides your income, like your education, your health, and your ability to affect decisions that affect your life, things like that. We wanted to encourage a shift from inputs, like how many programs we have, how much money we're spending, to outcomes. Are people actually living any longer? Are people earning more? Are people getting more education? We wanted to promote a holistic approach. We tend to work on issues in the United States in a really, really siloed way, but people experience their lives in a holistic way. And many of the factors that fuel advantage and disadvantage are actually really interlocking and experienced by the same person at the same time. We wanted to stimulate fact-based debate about the big issues that Americans really care about, using objective apples-to-apples comparisons, as well as really clear, accessible language. Sometimes we give presentations to, say, social scientists, and they don't find some of the gaps as surprising because they read about it all day, but everyday people and even people working in these issues are actually surprised by this. And we wanted to sort of present it in a way that people could really see and understand and sort of make their own decisions about things. And we wanted to provide a snapshot of today and set a benchmark that allows us to track change over time. And the reason for that is to hold our leaders accountable for progress on the things that really matter to us. And last but not least, we wanted to promote accountability for progress for other things, just besides money, that influence what people can do and be, by encouraging the collection of data in other areas. So in terms of income, we know GDP 4 times a year, we know the stock market every 16 seconds, but life expectancy, we're the only ones calculating it by all of these different disaggregations, and even the life expectancy for the country as a whole, or major racial and ethnic groups, comes out 2-3 years later. So really important data about non-monetary things comes out so infrequently in comparison to these monetary things. So we really wanted to create a demand for other kinds of indicators. So I've told you the big picture, and now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who is going to talk about the 3 areas of our indices of our index: health, education, and income.
Thanks, Kristen. So these kind of composite indexes are great for an overall summary, but then the benefit of them is also that you can then go deeper and look at what's happening in each of the constituent parts of the index as well. So the first part, as Kristen talked about, is health outcomes, which we use one simple indicator, as she said, which is life expectancy at birth. Life expectancy of the U.S. overall is 78.6 years. However, if you look at the gap that we have in the country, it's enormous between Hawaii and Mississippi. Hawaii, of course, being at the very top, and we can all imagine why that is, right? Because Hawaii is probably an incredibly beautiful place to live, and Mississippi at the bottom. And I think that that's not too surprising to people here. I think what was very surprising to us is when we looked at it by congressional district, and we found that 2 states side by side had a decade difference in terms of life expectancy. So a baby born today in suburbs of Washington, D.C., the 8th district in Virginia, some of you actually might come from there, can expect to live to nearly 84 years, whereas a baby born today in rural West Virginia, just 1 state away, can expect to live only to about 73 years. So an entire decade difference, 2 neighboring states. We also, as with the index as a whole, did a disaggregation by race and ethnicity, and it's really stunning to see the spread within the country. Of course, Asian Americans are living the longest across the country. African Americans the shortest, with about 13 years difference. The other thing that was really interesting in this, and I think this is something that many people find really unexpected, is that Latinos on average are living significantly longer than whites in the U.S. 80, 78, 9, 81, 2, 3, 5, 5 years, 5 years longer than whites on average. So they're the second longest lived racial and ethnic group in the United States. We also, in the work that we did for the Louisiana report, looked beyond just, and in every case, we use the indicator that we're using in the index as the beginning of the conversation, but then we look deeper at other indicators. We were particularly interested in Louisiana at looking at death rate of babies under 1 because it has parts of the state with very high infant death rates. So we found that overall, the U.S. Infant death rate is 7 babies per 1,000 live births, about the same as whites in Louisiana. African American in Louisiana infant death rate is double that, and there were some, and we also do, whenever we can, we do international comparisons. So we looked at what are the countries that have the same infant death rate as African Americans, Louisiana, and we found that both Russia and Bosnia have rates similar to those of African Americans in Louisiana. So, and then we found some parishes within Louisiana that have, excruciatingly high infant death rates, and we were able to sort of call attention to that. And in fact, it was very gratifying that after we launched the report, one reporter said, I really want to go and see what's going on there. So it was really able to shine a spotlight on areas, tremendous areas of disparity that really merited attention. Another thing that we do in this work is we try to look at stories. How does the same condition affect different people who are experiencing that condition differently? So for the first book that we did, we met these 2 girls in different neighborhoods, 2 active 8-year-old girls, both of whom had severe asthma. And we wanted to explore how that asthma was affecting their sort of life chances and their life course. And what we found was very different. One girl living in the suburbs of New York City in a relatively clean neighborhood with lots of parks, without cockroaches in her home, etc., and with nebulizers in all of her after-school programs and in her schools. Her school nurse was highly trained to deal with asthma, etc. As a result, Sophie was missing nearly no days of school, the occasional day of school, never spent those sort of frightening nights in the emergency room, had care whenever she needed it, and visited a specialist every year, an asthma specialist every year, because her parents had very good health insurance. Alexa, on the other hand, lived in public housing in a neighborhood where there were a lot of cockroaches, which were a known asthma trigger in her home and hard to control because she was living in a high-rise building. She lived a couple of blocks away from a waste transfer station, so tremendous, pollutants in the air. And her, the program, the after-school program she went to didn't have a nebulizer and didn't have a nurse who was trained to deal with kids who have an asthma attack. For her life chances were actually very different. She missed 9 to 16 days of school a year and was struggling with school actually because of missing it. Had those really, frightening nights in the emergency room. Didn't participate in gym because, they were concerned about having an asthma attack, so wasn't getting the kind of exercise she needed and actually was struggling with her weight. So just to say that two girls, same condition, very different outcomes for their lives, moving forward. And in each of these areas, we looked at a range of what were the policy levers and the actions that needed to be taken by individuals, by public policy, by the private sector, et cetera, to move scores for everyone forward, but also to look at those who are most vulnerable. And we don't have time now to talk about all of the policies and all of the recommendations in each section, so we'll just take sort of one for each one. So for health, what we realized in looking at what has really affected the move forward in life expectancy over the years, we've spent the last 2+ years in this country with a wrangling over health care reform, focused almost exclusively on medicine, on medical treatment and medical care. In fact, the advances that we've made in the last 4 or 5 decades in terms of life expectancy have actually had very little to do, or relatively little to do, with doctors and with drugs, and has had much more to do with the conditions and the circumstances of people's lives. Do they have, healthy school lunches? Can they play in their neighborhoods because it's safe to be outside? Are people living with the constant strain of economic insecurity and the potential of job loss? Is there fresh produce in neighborhoods? All of that range of what we call sort of the social determinants of health that are really critical for reducing premature death. Okay, second area is access to knowledge. In this one, in terms of educational attainment and school enrollment, as Kristen said, we looked at kids in school from ages 3 to 24, and then we looked at the highest degree attained from age 25 and up. So we tried to really look at the entire spectrum, starting, as Kristen said, from the critical preschool years. So whole country, darker colors are higher. The top ranked state, or whatever you see as a state, is Washington, D.C. At the bottom is Arkansas. What's really interesting is that Washington, D.C., of course, is a magnet for highly educated people who come here for high-skilled jobs. It's also, as you all well know, a place with struggling schools. So, in fact, it's brought up to the top by the bachelor and graduate degree rates, but at the bottom it actually has high school completion rates for adults today about on a par with Arkansas. So about 14% for Washington, D.C., and about 18% of adults today in those states have not completed high school. So it's really, Washington, D.C., of course, is sort of an exception because of the mobility of the population. Now, we also ranked, of course, by congressional district, and this is the top 5 congressional districts in terms of educational attainment and the bottom 5. And it's incredible to see that in the country, we range actually, in terms of high school, from congressional districts where, in fact, these are the top and bottom 5 overall in terms of educational attainment. But if you look at the full spread in the U.S. today, there's a district in Colorado, right around Denver, where only 4% of the adults today have not completed high school, and the 29th district in Texas, where nearly half the adults today have not completed high school. So the span is really quite enormous. We also, of course, looked at race and ethnicity and gender, and there's lots of numbers here. It tells lots of stories. I'll just tell you kind of quickly 3 stories. So the first one to notice, I think that's really interesting, is that in every racial and ethnic group except Asian Americans, women have higher overall educational outcomes than men. Only among Asian Americans do men have higher educational outcomes. The outcomes for Asian Americans are extremely high, and the range goes all the way down to Latino men at the bottom, where you can see that nearly 41% of Latino adults today in the U.S. have not completed high school. And what was really interesting in our research was to learn, and those of you who work in the field of education may already know this, but is that Texas and California together educate 50% of America's Latino school children. So if one wants to really make a focus on this issue, those are the states to concentrate on. And there's certainly lots more to see in this. I mean, it's interesting to see tremendous range in terms of, have a 4-year college degree between, the bottom and the top. Again, we looked at what are the policies, the actions by the private sector, et cetera, that will help to boost these scores. This table here focuses in particular on preschool, 3- and 4-year-olders, and this is an international comparison. So it's the U.S. compared against our peer nations, mostly affluent democracies, but these are the 30 countries of the OECD, and the U.S. has really quite low levels of children in preschool. So it's just under half of American kids are in preschool. The OECD average is 2/3, but there's also, France and Belgium and Sweden and Italy and Spain and Iceland with near universal preschool. One of the most forceful recommendations we make in terms of moving forward, moving scores up in terms of access to knowledge, is that preschool, particularly a high-quality, center-based preschool, is really been seen over and over again through years and decades of research to be the most cost-effective educational intervention today. And numerous studies have tried to look at, what the investment today will bring in terms of gains to a community tomorrow, and it's anywhere from 1 to 6 to 1 to 10. And what's incredible about preschool is that not only does it really help the kids who have come from a situation where they haven't had the kind of books and vocabulary, et cetera, that they need to enter school on an equal footing, but it also really reduces costs for the school in terms of the amount of special education, grade repetition, and reducing dropout rates, and then rippling out to the community. It's been shown to increase homeownership, wages, work performance, reductions in crime, a whole range of benefits for the community. That's not just a random thing. It's something that when kids are tracked over time, when they start with a solid, high-quality preschool, are able to, affect on the community. Getting to the last one, a decent standard of living. Here, this is just an illustration of why we really wanted to switch from using the sort of traditional measure of GDP to measuring median earnings. In the period from 1975 to today, GDP has nearly tripled. In that same time, earnings, median personal earnings, have really edged up only slightly. So for us, it's really a better measure of understanding how ordinary people are living and the progress that they've made during this period of time. So I'm just going to skip right now to the congressional district map. Incredible disparity, 2 miles apart. So in terms of, and this is again to remind you, it's all workers 16 and older, whether they work full or part-time, and it's only wages and salaries. So it's the money that they earn from their work. We are not including wealth and assets in this. We would have loved to, but unfortunately these data are not collected annually, and they're not collected in a way that we would have been able to put them into our index. So we discuss wealth and assets because they're critical for having an understanding of what's going on, and particularly for understanding sort of intergenerational mobility and change, but we aren't able to incorporate it into the index. So this is wages and salaries, sort of the typical worker. So in Manhattan's east side, the typical worker earns $60,000. 2 miles to the east in the South Bronx, the typical worker median personal earnings is about $18,000. A tremendous disparity within one very small area. Median earnings for the U.S. as a whole are nearly $30,000. So that sort of puts that into the context. Again, we did a breakdown also by race, ethnicity, and gender. With starting at nearly 30,000, you can see that Asian American and white men are about the same in the 40,000, 41,000 range, and it goes all the way down to Latino women who are earning in the $18,000 range, typical wages and salaries. So the gaps are enormous. Now, as compared with life expectancy, where women in all ethnic groups live longer than men, and education, where women have higher educational outcomes than men in all but one ethnic group, in earnings, men earn more than women in all groups. And the gender earnings gap between men and women in each of these groups is on average about $11,000, but it's greatest for white men and women, which is upwards of $15,000. And I'll talk about a little bit about why in a second. And then just to show a little bit, again, the work in parishes in Louisiana, something that really struck us when we were looking at earnings in the state is that there's sort of a Venn diagram between the earnings of whites and African Americans, and there's virtually no overlap. So basically, whites in the parishes in Louisiana sort of start in terms of their earnings where African Americans leave off. So it goes from about $12,000 to $25,500, and $20,000 up to about $37,000. Really startling disparities in terms of earnings by race. I'm just going to talk quickly about 2 policy recommendations that we make, and then we're finished. And this is one I think that NAF has done a fair bit of work on. which is having to do with family-friendly policies. The U.S. today is the only affluent democracy as of January 1st left with no federally mandated paid maternity leave. So if you see in that chart, this is the week's entitlement in a internationally comparable way, and we're the only ones who are left without any kind of federally mandated paid maternity leave. But in addition, the U.S. is also behind in terms of catching up. You know, in all of these countries, women have gone into the workforce, you know, in very, very large numbers, and policies in these countries have had to adjust to keep up with this new normal. The U.S. has barely adjusted. We're also behind on sick leave, on annual leave, on child care subsidies, on a whole range of policies. And absent these family-friendly policies, they have tremendous repercussions on both men and women. So in terms of couples, it can place tremendous stress on family life and really challenges in terms of balancing, you know, home and work responsibilities. Also, absent these kind of family-friendly policies, women who leave the workforce to care for their small children, their newborn babies, their elderly parents, pay a tremendous penalty, and that's a large part of that $11,000 average gender earnings gap. The inability to take leave to care has really an impact also on children's health and children's schooling, and that's been quite well documented. And I think that that's an issue that has gained a bit of traction in the last couple of years, but in the current sort of, you know, fiscal climate, it's perhaps stalled, but I mean, I think it's a policy that's way overdue, and you can see where we stand with our peer nations. And finally, we talk about asset building. So while we can't measure it in our index, we fully recognize how critical it is to address the issues of wealth disparities in this country. And basically, what you see when you look at this issue is that there's a whole raft of asset building incentives for the wealthy, you know, tax gain, mortgage deduction for your home, 529s, IRAs that are tax-free, etc. There's nowhere near that sort of menu of incentives for low-income people. We've put a few there. I think there are things that are going on in other countries that are really worthy of looking at, and we have very few of them in place for low-income people to have the equivalent sort of set of incentives to be able to, you know, to build self-reliance and to build assets for the next generation along the lines of those for wealthy Americans. And that's it. I just want to say two things about our tools that are online. Please feel free to play around with our MAP program, which is at measureofamerica.org maps. This is a map of teen pregnancy in the U.S. So the MAP program has over 100 indicators by state and a bit fewer by congressional district. It's not limited just to the ones that we measure in our index. It's a full range of indicators in political area, social, economic, military, a whole range of areas. So that's one of the tools that we have on our website. And the second one, which actually we've just updated, was a tool that we worked on in partnership with United Way, which is called the Common Good Forecaster, and we've just updated it with new census data. We'll be sort of relaunching this again on Monday. And basically in the left column is the stock of education in every state and in every county, and you can do it either by state or by county, and you sort of wave your magic wand and you can, you know, have every adult there who didn't graduate from high school graduate and see what the impact would be of that change on 10 other indicators in the community in terms of health, financial stability, education, and community involvement. And what we're trying to say is that, of course, investments in education, everybody recognizes are critical for better jobs and, you know, bigger paychecks, but it's actually critical for much more than that. So it includes, for instance, life expectancy, it affects birth weight, it affects the murder rate, it affects voting rates, it affects obesity, etc. So it's a tool to really see, you know, in numbers. So this one I put up was Texas. So I think it was, if every Texan today who doesn't have a high school diploma had completed high school, there'd be 78,000 fewer obese adults. So it's quite, it gets down to sort of the nitty gritty, using data, official data sets that are disaggregated and presented by educational attainment. And without further ado, thank you.
Well, thank you, Kristen and Sarah. There's an old saying in Washington that you're entitled to your own opinion, but not to your own facts. And so they've presented some fascinating facts that can be a consensus for analysis, if not necessarily for policy. For this part of our program, I would like to ask our speakers and our commentator, Dr. Sterling, to join us up at the table. And then you can either use the lectern here or deliver your comments directly from the seats if you'd like. But Dr. Sterling will be our first discussant, then we will take questions from the audience. Thank you.
Well, I'm very honored to be here today. Kristen knows I've been a real fan of her work for some time, and actually we got to work together on, at one point, in a particular application of it that I'll mention in a moment. And Kristen and Sarah, I think, have just done a phenomenal job in pushing forward this whole agenda. It's really not, in many ways, a new agenda. I think what they've done is they've taken it and actually taken it one step further, both by expanding on the number of indicators. Their Human Development Index has basically four or five indicators, depending on how you count the educational the measures. But what I really like about it is all the indicators that they have. And so some of the criticism, if you want the critique, that's my job here a little bit, is going to have to do with the limitations of the measures that are used. But then when you go to their site, you'll see that you can actually go to some of the other indicators and actually solve that problem. So, as I say, I'm a real fan of this work, and what do I like about it is it's not just that there's an attempt to focus past measures like the GDP, but it's an attempt to go on issues, particularly where I think we can measure progress. One of the great advantages of GDP, and people don't realize one reason why we rely so much on it, but it's partly because it converts things to a numeraire, which is sort of what we try with an index. That is, it's a single measure, so we can make comparisons over time. And then it also allows us to actually measure progress. So it's not just that we're measuring what is our GDP per capita, but we can measure how much progress we're making on that front over time. And I see all this effort with these indicators is trying to do somewhat the same thing. So it's not just that I'm interested in these state-to-state comparisons or nation-to-nation comparisons or locality-to-locality comparisons, but it really gives you a way of trying to actually measure over time your success in various areas. And you might say, well, gee, don't we always do that? Well, if you think about that, not really. I mean, take even such things as educational attainment. Where you get report cards in school or something like that. That's sort of a measure of attainment. It doesn't tell us very much about whether the attainment from one generation to the next is advancing very much. And so there are similar agendas going on elsewhere, such as in the educational front, where people are trying to figure out how are we going to measure progress over time. So I really like this measure because it allows us to do that type of advance. And also I really like the fact that we can do these comparisons from community to community. Now, let's be honest about it. All these comparisons, once you go to an index, are a tiny bit misleading. I mean, we can go to the U.S. News comparison of universities or something, and it counts number of library books or something when we know you can, through some other measure or some other means get access to the same books electronically or something like that. So every measure has its limitations, but it still helps at times to focus people's attention on where things are going well and where they're not, and comparing to your neighbors. I mean, quite honestly, that's what often motivates us to make change over time. And so I just really like that. Now, I indicated that this is in a long line of critiques of GDP, and just so you're aware of all of these various measures, there are these attempts to they've been going on since the 60s to measure social indicators. There have been attempts to take into account what we don't measure well. So there are all the things such as home production. I mean, one of the problems with a GDP measure is we don't measure what's produced in the home. So if you produce goods and services within the home, you make your own bookshelves, that's not counted. And in particular, we don't count education you might give to, say, to your own kids. We don't count in-kind production. We don't count, well, what it's often called the non-market or the subterranean economy, although we try to make adjustments there. We certainly don't count the value of leisure, right? So in GDP, if we get more leisure, that doesn't count at all. And we don't measure well happiness, and there's a whole literature now on when do we feel more happy and when don't we, and what nations feel happy and which ones don't. So there's a lot of things we don't measure in GDP, and then there's a whole literature on what things we do try to measure in GDP but we don't measure very well, such as we don't really measure quality well. And that's an interesting take too, is I see the evolution of society, because when GDP measures first came about, there was a tremendous emphasis on quantity, on physical output. And so we could measure when you had 2 widgets versus 1 widget, 2 battleships versus 1 battleship. That's sort of easy to measure that you've doubled your output. But do we really know the value of a heart transplant versus a knee operation when you're trying to measure quality? Not really. And as our economy proceeds into the future, it's very interesting that more and more of the industrial output of the nation and more of the occupations in the nation are more along these efforts at quality. And the simple example is healthcare. Just think of the extraordinary expansion of healthcare, or information, if you want to, or entertainment. These things are going to be very hard to measure. Who's to say that a movie today is really that much better than a movie in the past? I mean, as we move along, the measure of productive output is going to become less and less of an indicator of our advances, and so we're going to have to turn to the types of measures that we've got here. So I could go on and on. What GDP doesn't measure. Just a tiny little story. When I was in, there's times we don't even allow people to do these measures. When I was at the Treasury Department, we had a provision in the 1986 Tax Reform Act creating an office to try to measure depreciation, which might sound to you like a very boring issue. But the business lobby came in and forced us to abandon the office because they were afraid if we measured depreciation well, that certain companies like airlines wouldn't get the depreciation allowances that they wanted. So. What else don't we measure well? And this is something I guess maybe you can answer in the questions and answers. We obviously don't measure well those negative pieces of output. The economists, we often call them externalities, but pollution. You do have the crime. You do have the crime measures. So you do have this not in their index, but it's actually in their long list of indicators. And then there's always this issue in GDP of just how well do we even measure certain things that we value? I mean, is the value of cosmetics really the value of the cosmetics that cost $100 when there's $2 of input and $50 of advertising? I mean, does that really measure how well we're doing as a society? It's a real question. So say there's all sorts of things we could do to improve on our measures. I think that the approach taken here is a very sound one. It tries to say, okay, what can we measure? What can we measure well? What can we measure every year? For the U.S. measure, at least, what can we measure every year from one locality or one state to the other state? And so let's concentrate on what we can do. Now, having done that, as I say, I think it's a great advance. The next question is, okay, isn't it fair also to take any measure, particularly a numeraire, and criticize it as well? And I would say yes. Whatever criticisms you might have for a GDP measure, you might also have for a Human Development Index. So just to give you a couple of quick examples, the education measure they have is really, in my view, not an outcome measure. It's still a bit of an output measure. And I have no problem with that. I think the emphasis on outcome measurement, we can have another discussion on this, is totally exaggerated in our society. There's a lot of cases we don't measure outcomes. We just try to come closer to measuring them. So that's a very, very, very minor critique. On life expectancy, I might like to see life expectancy. Maybe you have this for not just at age of birth, but say at age 20 or something, because I want to know how much of this is actually just, is influenced by what's going on in the very young ages, which is largely related to the medical care, largely related to such things as how well women take care of themselves in pregnancy, which is very different than, say, life expectancy at age 20 or age 65. Minor thing. I think that'd be easy actually for you to, if it's not there, it'd be easy for you in your other indices. My biggest fear on the current index is with the measure of earnings, because there's reasons, for instance, that the earnings measure differs from GDP, and it's not just that median versus average. It's also going back to what I mentioned about healthcare, as more and more of our economy has come about in services like healthcare that often comes in through the back door. It's often not counted in earnings in employment, and even if you count in earnings in employment, the government now spends about over $10,000 per household providing health care to individuals, and that's not counted either. So our earnings measure is differing partly from our GDP measure, partly because of things that we aren't measuring. And in terms of progress, I guess there's another thing. This would be much harder to do. There are issues that come about when you do these state-to-state comparisons. Our geographic region. When we're trying to measure progress, there are cases where people can be making extraordinary progress, and yet the average won't show that. So the particular example that does show up in Texas and California, particularly because of their large number of immigrants. A lot of immigrants can move to this country, and by moving to this country, make substantial progress, and yet they can pull down the average level of earnings or the average level of education just simply because they're starting from a much lower base. So you get a different measure when you're trying to measure progress of people one at a time and adding it up as opposed to when you're looking at averages. My final comment, because I want to open this up to discussion, has to do with the policy conclusions. I don't know that all the policy conclusions that we came to today that our authors put forward necessarily fall out of the index, even though I actually agree with most of them. So I agree we should actually do something like have child accounts, although I care less whether it starts at birth. I've actually got a proposal myself for how we could try to automatically enroll more people in pension plans, as well as try to cajole employers to do more and provide benefits. I think we need to put a lot more money into children's education. So I agree with most of the policy conclusions they've come to. I don't know that they really follow fully just from the index are the indicators that they're putting forward. What we ideally want to do is to measure the success of particular policies in moving those particular indicators, so we really can move them one on top of the other. But I don't know just that the fact that some state has a lower indicator tells us necessarily what policy we should pursue, and also there are all the technical issues as to how you pursue that policy. So I agree that there's broad discrimination in our society, particularly against child care providers, and that, by the way, is mainly women, but it also includes men who decide they're going to go home at dinner time rather than hang around that office where it's so important. But I don't know that necessarily tells you in precise detail exactly how you want to change the policy to provide better, more equal outcomes for those groups. But as I say, I think this is just a great step forward. I really like it, and thank you and your colleagues for this work. It's great. Thanks.
We'll take questions now. If you would please identify yourselves and wait until the microphone comes up. In the back middle there.
Good afternoon. I have a question about Kristen's presentation earlier, and I'm just wondering if I misunderstood. When you were outlining how the development measures were being used throughout the world, you mentioned the Arab world, and I wonder if I misunderstood. You referred to them redefining gender and access to education, which I read as a euphemism for perhaps constraining women in those areas. Could you elaborate on that?
Oh, sure. This is on, right? What I meant to say is that the Arab Human Development Report series what they're known for is not as much their index. Like Brazil, they have an incredibly detailed index, and so businesses look at the index and make decisions based on the index. In the Arab region, there's a regional Arab Human Development Report that's been coming out for about 10 years now, and it comes out every couple of years. And there they look less at an index and more as using the human development approach as a way to talk about important issues. And they have, the authors of these reports are always specialists from the region. They're not, people from other regions. And what they've identified in those series is that these deficits in access to knowledge, deficits in gender equality, in human security, and in human security, I'm missing one for some reason, but that these deficits, in a sense, are sort of hamstringing human progress in the region. And it's less that they have identified, that they've affixed numbers to all of these things. They more use the conceptual framework of human development to discuss things. That's the difference.
David Grant with Common Lot Productions. Two questions briefly. The first one is, are the earnings that you had there inflation adjusted? And the second, more complicated question was, I was glad to see in the Common Good forecaster the point about community participation as one of the metrics, because you mentioned that much earlier. And the happiness index, and I follow the UNDP things for quite some time, so it's quite interesting to see this applied to the U.S. But the question that I basically have is objective versus subjective feelings about one's well-being. The happiness index, I think, has a lot to do with the subjective feeling. And I think the community participation point might also include that. So how do you want to increase that aspect of it or not, is really basically my question.
Oh, we do adjust for inflation, and then I'll pass the other question. The more complicated part, I'll pass to Sarah.
So, just to say that, just to remind everybody that an index is really a very crude summary, right? It's to get the conversation going. The actual human development approach is, as Kristen said when she spoke about it, really about everything that matters to a person. And so certainly the ability to participate in the decisions that affect your life and in your community are essential, are absolutely critical to a human development framework and to a look at, how you expand your opportunities. Unfortunately, the indicators that we have, today, even in this country, with relatively more indicators than many of the countries that Kristen and I had worked in before, in terms of community participation are very inadequate. And I think it would have been probably impossible for us to include an indicator in the index itself, but also we didn't want the index to become sort of a Christmas tree with too many baubles on it. We wanted to keep it that sort of simple advocacy tool. But just to remind you that the concept itself is much broader than what we're measuring in those indicators. In terms of this literature on happiness, I think we've been really interested to see that it's gaining a lot of momentum in this country now. There's some really interesting work going on in terms of happiness. I think our concern with some of this work on happiness is some of the counterintuitive results that you get out of it. It's interesting to see. We sort of do a whole. There's a whole box in the book where we really talk about sort of comparing sort of some of the objective outcomes that one finds in our index and some of the happiness work, and it's quite interesting to see. Sometimes it's really at odds. And I think one of the things that really, there's lots of stories one can tell about what happiness measures or doesn't measure, but one of the things that really persuades me is some of the research that looks, for instance, at somebody who had a disabling illness, lost a limb or something like that, and within 3 to 4 months after, they go back to the same happiness level that they were at. So there are some issues with subjective indicators of happiness that I find somewhat less persuasive for a policy conversation than some of the objective indicators do. I don't know, Kristen, if you want to add to that.
No, and also lottery winners. They're euphoric for a while, and then they come back the same, but I think objectively you can say that the lottery winner has more choices and opportunities than the person who's had a disabling accident, sort of from a.
Okay, right here and then at the back.
Hi, I'm Terry Langston. Thank you so much for the report, Kristen and Sarah. I've written, quoted it, and it's so helpful for all of us doing work on human resources. What are your plans for what are the plans of the project for getting this information out? Because we're in a time of just devastating political dialogue where to say, for instance, that we need to equalize income is just is countered by as a really pejorative term, and so you're entering a fray that is very difficult in political language. What could be done? What more could be done to get the Human Development Index way of seeing the world out into to the American people?
We've got about 10 minutes. Why don't we take two or three questions?
Okay.
And then we'll have a round robin.
Did you still have a question?
She hasn't had hers answered.
I think we're going to take a couple of questions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll just add three more quick ones. Tomas Salcedo with the National Education Association. Great to hear. I'm going to likely live longer. I'll just work harder to catch up with everybody else. On the American Community Survey, is there a tie in your work to the Census's American Community Survey, which we are using to try to, again, help local school sites keep up with the demographic changes in their areas? Also, the question on whether additional points or layers can be added to your website would be interesting to, we're great fans, very useful approach, but the whole point of helping schools, there's a couple of thousand struggling schools out there. We'd like to add those points so we could drive some assistance to those schools and help improve the chances there. And do you have any other plans for other states beyond California, and how can we help you achieve those plans? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Blair Forlaw. I'm under contract with the St. Louis Regional Chamber and Growth Association. So those of us who work in bi-state or tri-state metropolitan areas, we see a report like this and we say, oh, darn, more good data we can't use. So I just wondered, I thought I heard you mention that you'd done some, you developed indices for major metropolitan areas. If so, do we need to buy the book, or is that on your website? And do you have you analyzed those data, and could you say anything about the index in metro for people who live in metro areas as compared to other parts of states? Thanks.
Do you want me to start? I'll do a random thing and leave you the others that I don't want to answer.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Getting me back to the other question.
So just to start out by saying it's great to have audiences say, how can you get this out there wider? I think that it's a crowded marketplace of ideas in this country. I think for Kristen and I, who had come from an international environment, we were working in countries where there were sort of 1 or 2 studies on issues, to come and start working in the U.S. where there's like 700 studies on, and good, solid studies on every issue. It's really challenging. And I think in terms of that, we would throw that question back to you all. I mean, we have worked in countries where this index has, as Kristen said, been adopted as a government statistic, where politicians live or die by how they do on the index every year, where it's really, avidly awaited every year to see whether things went up or went down. I think it would be our dream to see something like this. I mean, we don't insist that it be this particular index, but something that, is really a counterweight to GDP in terms of human lives. And, we would throw it back to you any way you can help us. To get it out there, we are willing to partner with you on that. And just that other question about the states is, as of right now, we've been talking a bit to people in Arkansas and Texas about the possibility of doing reports there. Our thing is, we have no aspiration sort of to do all 50 states. We will work in states where there are active partners there who will, give it legs. We don't want to just write a report and then go back to our offices in Brooklyn. We will partner with organizations in states who are really interested in seeing this work done and in sort of bringing it down to the very local neighborhood level. So so in terms of plans for other states, as of right now, we're concentrating on finishing the California report and getting it out there, but we're very receptive to other partnerships as well. And in terms of the question about data points, we are happy to talk to you. Sorry, back there. We're happy to talk to you about other indicators that you think are critical in terms of getting them onto our website. If they're available, we can add them in. So and sorry, the one question about the ACS. I'm not sure if I misunderstood, but the basis of the earnings data and the education data are the ACS, the annual ACS. It's a tremendously valuable asset that our government invests in, and we hope that our government will continue to invest in it, because I think it's a gold mine of information for people who are trying to work on these issues.
And just to address the point about regional areas, we've done, the national report and the state report. We would love to do some metro area reports, because that would enable us to cross boundaries. So many places like, New York, for instance, the New York metro area is obviously not just New York City. It's, parts of Connecticut, parts of New Jersey, Washington, D.C., it's Washington, Virginia, Maryland, so. Oh, yeah. We would, give us a call. We'd love to do it, yeah. We would love to do it. And that, again, just to reiterate Sarah's point, we're a small team, and we want to produce things that people use. We don't want to just write things to sit on a shelf. So we wouldn't sort of on spec do a report unless we had partners there. So in California, we have 8 funders, eight big organizations, California Endowment, all these large organizations are all supporting it. And that's great, because they're hosting the launch events, they're talking about it, they're using it in their work, they're sharing it with their constituents. So it really has legs, and it can inform policy and make a difference. And so we, that's all we want in any group, in any state or region or metro area we're working in. Eugene?
Maybe I'll try to answer the policy-related question about how do we operate in this type of environment. Michael could actually answer that too. He's probably itching to jump in here. But my numbers now show that the federal government is like spending $31,000 a household, and it's collecting $19,000 in taxes, which basically says, this is what I work on a lot, and it basically says that there's going to be huge policy shifts in the future. And the question is, how does one play in that environment? And I think inevitably it's going to be both tax increases and spending cuts relative to that level, because that gap just continues into the future. And the states are having similar problems. So I would say 2 things with respect to the topic at hand here. One is I think it doesn't hurt at all to be able to get things like these indices out just into the broad press. I mean, I partly criticized like the U.S. News and World Report's set of indices for colleges, but it does. I mean, some of it can be misleading, but some of it really does spur people to say, hey, I've got to make some changes because I don't want to be down at the bottom list. We can debate whether your 1 or 5 is really measured well. But it really does spur action, and I think publicity is not a bad thing to have out there, and it does really hold people accountable. There was an article in Health Reform by a noted sort of a reporter, doctor as well, who basically went into a very high-cost area on healthcare and examined what was going on. And one of the interesting aspects of that article wasn't just that he discovered what was going on, is that there was a certain bit of a shaming that took place there, and some people within the community started asking themselves, well, what's going on, and why are we such a high-cost area relative to everybody else? And finally, I'll just say that the one thing I think all of us, at least in a room like this, always ought to be pushing for is ways of really relating the research. What we really want to know is what policies really affect things like these indices or the various indicators, and that type of research is, I think, going to be vitally crucial in this policy environment, because there are going to be cutbacks, and let's hope that the cutbacks are in areas that are not really effective, and that there are actual increases in those programs that really move us forward on scales such as presented here.